85mm f1.4 lenses are traditionally very big, heavy and expensive, but Sigma broke the trend, and today I'll be having an initial review of this lens here. This is the Sigma 85mm f1.4 DG-DN art lens that is launched just late last year. I'm Richard and welcome to ZP Productions, and on my hand is the Sigma 85mm f1.4 DG-DN art lens. Now you can see straight away that this lens is really small. Notice the size of the lens. Now if I put into perspective for you, this is the 85mm f1.2 RF art lens. This lens weighs twice the weight, 625 gram, nearly 1.2 kg for this lens here. And you can see it is also 2 cm taller and significantly bigger. Sigma did a very good job making this 85mm f1.4 really small and relatively light. And the price wise, 1.2k USD, and in Singapore, even more affordable, 1.4k Sing dollars. But what did Sigma do for this lens? How is the build quality? How is the image quality itself? Let's take a look at it in this review here. First, let's talk about build quality. Now, this lens is quite a premium build lens. It is an art lens, so a mix of metal and plastic and rubber. So you can see a very big focusing ring. I'm turning it here, and you can see that it has an aperture ring that is clicky. So overall, Sigma put quite a bit of effort making this lens here. Now, on this lens itself, there are a few interesting things. Firstly, 77mm filter thread. This is quite small for 85mm f1.4. Next, there are 3 switches and 1 button. First switch here locks the aperture ring at A. So if I put it at A here, lock it up, no more turning, unlock it, turn. Quite a nice touch. The only thing is that it can only lock at A, cannot lock at any other aperture numbers. So let's say if you're doing studio and just want to shoot at f8, you can't do that. You have to lock at A, then set it on your dial at f8, and you have a lower chance of knocking it off f8. So it would be nice if you could have locked at any aperture itself. Next thing, on the other side of the lens, there is a click and declick. No more sound for the aperture ring. Now this is something that I see in a lot of the modern Sony lenses, but it's also now found in this Sigma lens. And by the way, this Sigma lens is only for the mirrorless camera, for the Sony or the L mount, and maybe that's the reason why. Then there is the usual AF/MF switch, and then there is 1 button here. Now this button is by default AF lock for the Sony system, and you can configure it to have some other functions, up to you. Now this is a pure mirrorless camera lens, so there is no coupling between the focusing ring and the mechanism inside, so it is free spinning. And there is not much tactile feeling, no hard stops or anything. And you have to connect the lens to the body to have any form of focusing itself. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the hood. Now the hood is actually quite big. Put it on and the lens actually significantly gets bigger. Take it off, it's significantly smaller. The nice thing on the hood that it has a button to release the hood itself, so no accidental release. And the hood is actually quite big, so in real world it's actually quite nice to stand the camera and the lens on the hood. So it is a quite nice touch. Though I do like the Sony rubber, there is no such rubber on the Sigma lens itself. And that's about it for build quality. Now, in terms of handling in the field, which I usually cover for my reviews, this lens is quite small and light. So let me show you when I mount it on my A7S III. Overall, you can see that the shape and size is actually quite balanced for the A7S III. The weight is a little bit forward, so the camera does want to tilt forward, and it can strain your wrist if you're holding it with one hand for a prolonged period of time. But other than that, I would say it's easy to hold in one hand still, and you can direct your model, especially for portraiture, with your left hand. Now, the only thing I want to talk about that is not so great of this lens is this space here, where my finger is actually moving. Now, this edge here, where I'm touching here, of this lens is very close to the handle, and this edge is not very rounded. It's actually quite edged. No, it's quite a sharp edge. So if you have big hands or big fingers that go into here and rub against this, it will cause a certain amount of discomfort. But for my fingers, not too bad. I don't touch this thing, and I don't move around too much with my fingers. I usually tend to hold it with one hand, so I grip it really tight. But for somebody who like to use two hands and then fidget their hand around, this may actually cause some irritation. Now the next thing I'll talk about is autofocus. I didn't have much time to test it. I'll say as I have yet to miss a single shot as long as the AF box is on the subject's face. That said, my subject is relatively static. I'm mainly doing portraiture, and the most is that my subject is spinning around. So I will do a more extensive test in my follow-up review in 2 weeks' time. Now, one thing I want to talk about is that the AF is relatively silent. You don't hear much sound. That's my shutter, by the way. So it is quite nice, the AF is quite silent for this lens. So if you are having a mic on top, you will probably not capture much sound from the lens itself. And that's about it for AF. Similarly, in image stabilization, I have used it in 1/20 of a shutter for my night test shot. No problem, I still got a relatively sharp photo itself, but I have yet to extensively test it, especially for portraiture. So I'll leave it for later reviews again. Now let's talk about image quality. In image quality, I have two types of tests. One is a synthetic test, which is on still life and objects. And then I have a real portrait test behind. So for the first part, which is synthetic test, let's take a look at a scene outside my window. And I can tell you that if I was to compare with the Canon R5 and the 85mm 1.2, by the way, because this is the A7S, it's only 12 megapixels, take my resolution and sharpness with just a pinch of salt, because if you are using a very, very high resolution camera like the A7R4, the result may differ a little bit. But if you're using something like the A7C or the A7 III, it may not differ too much to you. So for the sharpness itself, when I compare with the R5, because this is 12 megapixel and the R5 is 45, the R5 is at 50%, while the A7S III and the 85 1.4 Sigma is at 100%. And you can see that firstly in this scene, in the center, notice firstly is that the sharpness is very similar, and there's also no chromatic aberration between the windows and the sky. Now if you go to the bottom left hand corner, the thing repeats itself again. The sharpness is very similar, at least when this is 100% and the R5 is at 50%. Go to the other corner, the same result happens again. What it means is that at least at 12 megapixel, the sharpness is very uniform from the center to the side. And regardless of corners, it seems to perform as good as the 85 1.2 here. Once again, this is 45 megapixels, and if I was to zoom in at 100% for this and 200% for this, there is a significant difference in details. So I will probably do a follow-up review in terms of resolution and sharpness with a A7R III if I can get my hands on in the upcoming months or two. And that's about it for sharpness. The next thing I'll talk about is chromatic aberration, and I will use it with this particular night scene. By the way, this night scene is shot at 1/20 of a shutter, and it shows that IS is working pretty okay. Now, for this particular night scene, let's take a look at the LED tubes at the side. Notice there's no chromatic aberration, and most lenses, other than very premium and good lenses such as the 85 1.2 here, or maybe the 105 f1.4, most other lenses do suffer from chromatic aberrations on the LED tubes itself. They come in the form of either green, purple, or red. And this lens, notice, no chromatic aberration. Everything is like the light bulb itself. It is slightly glowy, and there is no chromatic aberration or very ugly bloom. In fact, it still looks quite sharp. Now, let's take a look at chroma, which is the spot of lights at the edge of the screen with weird distortions. And this lens do not suffer from that problem. If I look at the left side of the screen, there are lights and there are no weird fans or glows or weird shapes. So chroma for this lens is quite well controlled. And this is a result, I would say, as regardless of megapixel, it will probably be the same. So overall, this lens put a good showing in terms of chromatic aberration and chroma control. And I would say that considering the static scene so far, I would say the result is pretty fantastic. Now let's take a look at longitudinal chromatic aberration. I have a silver plate and I shoot right where in the center here. So you can see that the edges from the plate that fans behind and in front, notice there are no chromatic aberration in terms of longitudinal chromatic aberration. Now this plate is of course not the most silver plate in the world, but if there are any form, you can see some tinge of green and some green tinge of purple usually. But in this case, I don't see much on this lens, so the control is quite good. And I show you the worst case in terms of chromatic aberration. This is a black, I would say, as cage for one of my cameras. From these are one of the small rig cages. You can see with the very bright curtain window behind, and it's glowing like crazy. you can see a bit of chromatic aberrations in the front and the back. And the comparing shot next to it is actually the R5 with the 85 1.2, which is very famous for very good chromatic aberration control. And you can see the result in such an extreme case is similar. So it shows that in terms of CA control, this lens in the worst case scenario like just now is quite on par with a lens nearly 2.5 times its price. So a very good performance by the Sigma itself. Now that's about it for the synthetic test. Let's take a look at some of the real world tests itself. The first real world test I want to talk about is, the shot with a backlit, window itself. And you can see here there is slight hazing, which means a loss of contrast on the darker regions of the photos, and you can see it's quite obvious. Now you may be wondering, what is a shot without a haze? So let me show you a shot without a haze, and that is done with a 35mm GM lens, 35mm f1.4 GM to be exact. No haze, very good contrast throughout. So the Sigma do suffer a little bit of haze when you have a very bright background. So don't overexpose your shot too much, like this shot here. And then I will zoom in a little bit, and you can see because she's wearing a black top, you can see a little bit of chromatic aberration, and that can be just corrected with a little dropper in Lightroom and it goes away. Now the amount of chromatic aberration, if you are using a higher megapixel camera, will be definitely more, but I see as not as intrusive as it should be. And once again, if you look at the synthetic test, it is quite on par with the 85 1.2 RF. Now the only lens that has a better CA control than this lens is probably the GF110 on the GFX system, but I don't have the lens already, so I can't test it out. But yeah, this lens do perform pretty well in such a case. So now let me show you another real world test, and this time it's outdoor where the contrast is there, but not as extreme as just now. So let's take a look at this shot here. First, I will say that there is no chromatic aberration in the shot. I checked the entire photo shoot, I don't see any. And next, when I zoom in an eye, it is very sharp. As long as the shutter speed is high, the sharpness on the eye, as long as the focus is there, it's tag sharp, regardless is it at center of the frame or off center, which is quite normal if you are doing portraiture. Normally you shoot at the 1/3 mark, and that's where your eyes will lie. So overall, the sharpness of this lens in most portrait position is very, very, very good. And as I said again, no chromatic aberration. And if you look at longitudinal in this shot here, where I have the silver railings behind her, also no chromatic aberrations. And I cannot find any form of tinging, be it in the bokeh or in the subject itself, for my portrait shoot, which is a very good showing. I mean, I have seen lenses that did worse, but once again, I only did like 3 photo shoots with this lens, and probably in my follow-up review, I'll update on this matter again. And lastly, let's take a look at the bokeh. Now, the bokeh of this lens overall is quite good. You can see a full body shot. This is landscape full body, and you can see the water behind. There is some patterns in front, but the patterns behind just fade away. Also, look at the trees in one of the shots. Notice the trees also will just meld together nicely. No weird shape, no weird pattern. So overall, quite nice. The railings also do not have any weird linings when they are behind the subject. Now, I don't have a chance to test a bokeh in front of the subject, and sometimes I notice that some lenses have problem with it. I will try it again in my follow-up review. Now, how does the bokeh compare with this lens, however? I didn't do it in the real-world test, but I shot my railing and then with a forest behind. You can see the bokeh here. Now, the 1.2 bokeh is definitely better, definitely smoother, but not by much. And I will tell you that if I didn't put a comparison shot here, you probably can't tell which lens actually took the shot itself. And that's about it for image quality. I didn't have too much time with this lens to test any further, but overall, with the A7S III, the quality from this lens is fantastic. This is only a 12 megapixel camera, but other than resolution, everything else should hold true across any camera that you use, and so far, this lens is performing superb, at least on par with the 85 1.2 in all the parameters I have tested just now. So you may be wondering, what did Sigma give up to have such a lens this small, and if you ask me, not so expensive, because this is just 1.2K USD, or this is like 2.8K USD. So Sigma actually gave out something, and that is distortion. So let me show you my door, corrected and uncorrected. So the left side is uncorrected, the right side is corrected, and you can see the lines on the left side is significantly curved. Now this is the worst performing distortion I've ever seen on an 85mm lens. This is really, something that is related to cheaper lenses. But then again, distortion can be easily fixed in software, as you can see, so not a big deal. However, just note that fixing distortion does mess around with your sharpness and resolution. So if you want the absolute sharpest lens, the moment you activate distortion control, it will be less sharp. But considering how sharp the lens is so far, I would say as the impact will be quite minimal. Now, in my final thoughts, what do I think of this lens? Firstly, for 1.2K USD in B&H Photo today, or 1.4K Sing dollars in Singapore, it's actually more affordable in Singapore. This lens is a steal. It is light, 625 grams. It is small. It is very sharp. Chromatic aberration is very well controlled. There is no weakness, if you ask me, so far when I use the lens. Distortion is something that can be fixed. Yes, you lose a bit of resolution if you do fix the distortion, but for the purpose of portraiture, normally that is not a big deal. At least you can fix it and the loss of resolution won't actually matter too much. Overall, I'm very happy with this lens. I used it for 1 week and I'm very, very happy with it. It makes life a lot easier. It is easier to carry around. It is lighter. And if you ask me once again, this lens is something I will definitely recommend if you are a Sony shooter. At least with my review here, I'll recommend it for A7S III. This is a super low resolution camera, and any A7 III user. Now, for the A7R user, I'm not 100% sure on how sharp the lens is till I get an A7R camera. But that will be in the future, maybe in a month time. I will loan an A7R III and do a follow-up review for this particular lens. And then I will link both of them together to let you guys have a final thoughts on this lens itself. So for my initial thoughts of this lens, if you are a Sony user, I highly recommend it. This is probably one of the best 85mm lens. I'm pretty sure this is better than the GM because the GM got weird hazing and a lot more CA. So this lens is definitely better than it. And considering the price of 1.2K USD, highly recommend it. Get it if you are a Sony user and want to do portraiture. One of the more nicer lenses you can ever get on your hands today. And together with the new Sigma 35mm or the Sony 35mm GM, I think you got a perfect portrait combination of 35 and 80 today that is small, light and compact. This is the first time I would say as Mirrorless meet the objective of being smaller, lighter, sharper, and overall more usable than the DSLRs. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I will see you next time in my next review. Do like and subscribe. Until then, bye-bye.